Confusion reigns tonight. If it was any other American president, you'd say we are looking at a nuclear arms race with incredibly serious and uncertain consequences. But this is Donald Trump we're talking about, so it might just be an idle remark. Welcome to the future. Also on News at 10 tonight. New footage of the lorry in the Berlin attack heading towards the Christmas market, but still no sign of the suspect. The final evacuees drive out of eastern Aleppo after 4 years and a terrible siege. The city is now back under Assad's rule. Another prison riot. Inmates are in control of a wing at HMP Swaleside in Kent. Scotland is braced for Storm Barbara. And the Beatles fan with the most extraordinary collection of memorabilia. All of it now up for sale.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. We always knew it was going to be different under Donald Trump. And today, the president-elect decided to threaten the small matter of an international nuclear arms race on Twitter. Mr. Trump's tweet wasn't quite as random as it first sounds. He was responding to President Putin, of whom he's an admirer, saying he wants to improve Russia's nuclear arsenal. But the salient point perhaps is this. Twitter might be many things, but nuanced it is not. And if this is how policies are going to be set out, then we all, frankly, have some serious rethinking to do. Was this a substantial, world-changing exchange of threats in the new order, or an attention-seeking, off-the-cuff remark?
Amazing people. These are amazing people. Thank you.
Only yesterday at his Florida estate, Donald Trump was meeting with US Air Force generals. Few details emerged of what was discussed, and the president-elect has certainly never expressed a clear nuclear weapons policy. But now, 28 days before he becomes commander-in-chief, he has sent out a tweet that could overturn the very idea of nuclear arms control. He wrote, "The United States must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes." America already has 4,500 nuclear missiles, and while some experts argue there is an urgent need to modernize the arsenal, the idea of greatly expanding the number of weapons would threaten an immediate arms race with the Russians and the Chinese. And potentially other nuclear-armed nations would feel less pressure to show restraint. In fact, Trump's tweet followed by just a few hours a declaration from President Putin in Moscow, talking not of expanding the Russian nuclear arsenal, but of improving it to ensure their missiles could penetrate Western defenses. One of the most alarming features of the nascent Trump presidency is his apparent lack of basic knowledge of America's nuclear weapons infrastructure and doctrine.
To me, nuclear is just the power, the devastation is very important to me.
On the campaign trail, he appeared not to understand or even know about the nuclear triad, the three methods by land, sea and air that America can launch a retaliatory strike.
What's your priority among our nuclear triad?
Nuclear changes the whole ballgame. Frankly, I would have said, get out of Syria, get out. If we didn't have the power of weaponry today, the power is so massive. I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
Perhaps the single biggest question about Trump has been his temperamental suitability to be the man with sole access to the nuclear launch codes.
Donald Trump is uniquely unqualified to be president.
Even President Obama latched onto that as a critical weakness.
If somebody can't handle a Twitter account, they can't handle the nuclear codes.
This single tweet by Trump will be ringing alarm bells around the world. It may be a form of communication we need to get used to, but few believe that Twitter is the right arena for altering decades of American nuclear weapons policy.
And Robert joins us from Washington tonight. Robert, I guess we have to be honest with everyone at home, frankly. We're still grappling with this, aren't we? What's your take, and what is the take of the policymakers you talk to in Washington about how seriously we should be taking Donald Trump's tweets at this point?
Well, look, normally, Tom, this area of sort of nuclear arms policy is so technical, it's so consequential to international security that a president or a president-elect would only talk about it after months or even years of, exquisitely careful analysis and deliberation. So the idea that President-elect Trump is simply tweeting it, apparently spontaneously, and making policy on the hoof is pretty bizarre. But people here are saying, look, he's not commander-in-chief, he's not president yet, not for another 28 days, so perhaps people can shrug it off, but certainly all that changes at midday on January the 20th when he does become commander-in-chief, and then such tweets as these will have real-world consequences.
OK, Robert, but just let's deal with the substance of it for a moment. Is there an argument for changing or increasing America's nuclear arsenal? Is anyone within the policy establishment suggesting that?
Well, this is exactly the point. It's not just the sort of platform is a strange one to discuss nuclear policy. The content, frankly, is a fringe analysis of where American nuclear policy should be. Almost all the nuclear experts that I know say that 4,500 nuclear weapons is a perfectly reasonable threshold. It doesn't need to go any higher. So it really is strange that he's talking about an expansion of that. In fact, even his incoming defense secretary has talked about perhaps the potential for not having any land-based or silo-based missiles, instead of could rely instead just on submarine-launched and air-launched nuclear weapons. So this tweet is not just unsettling and, as we've discussed, bizarre. It also has the potential to be a real rift within the incoming administration.
OK, Robert, 2017 is going to be an interesting year, if nothing else. But for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, back in Europe, 3 nights on from the Berlin Christmas market Lorry attack, there is no sign of the net closing on the main suspect. German police have made one step forward, though, of sorts. The fingerprints of their main suspect, a Tunisian asylum seeker with a long criminal record and links to extremists, have been found on the lorry. The market he drove into reopened today. This is it tonight. It's been protected by more barriers, but with the suspect still on the loose, it was inevitably perhaps still a very nervy place today.
These images emerged tonight, taken from a dashboard camera on Monday. From the left of screen, a lorry speeds into view. It then crashes into the market. Cars stopped. People ran. After the terror, the humiliation. He's in hiding on his 24th birthday, but Anis Amri is embarrassing German intelligence. Police raided homes across Germany, and yet still no sign. Attempts to arrest him for a 4th and perhaps final time this year have been complicated by his 36-hour head start. Though officers did question several people, 4 taken away in Dortmund. He left his ID card in the lorry he used as a weapon, but today investigators discovered he'd left his DNA there too. The Interior Minister, alongside Chancellor Merkel, said the suspect really is, with high probability, the perpetrator. In the driving cabin, fingerprints were found, and there's additional evidence that supports this.
Fingerabdrücke gefunden worden.
Ich bin in den letzten Tagen sehr stolz gewesen, wie
The Chancellor added, in the last few days I've been very proud of how most people have reacted in a level-headed way to this situation. But as she spoke, more of what the authorities knew about Anis Amri was becoming clear. In March, they were aware he was trying to buy weapons, possibly to carry out an attack. It's also claimed the authorities here had been told by the Tunisians of intercepted conversations with IS militants, also offering himself up as a suicide bomber, and that he'd been placed on a US no-fly list. Investigators have travelled to Tunisia, where Anis Amri's heartbroken family say he must be innocent. If my brother is listening to me, I want to tell him to surrender. Even for our family, we will be relieved. We don't do such things. Everyone knows our reputation here. At the Christmas market in Berlin, a sort of normality returned. Except this isn't normal. Concrete blocks were put up as the shutters went up for the first time since Monday night.
I think these people who do these things, they have not to push us down. You have to be strong and show that you still like to enjoy the Christmas time.
In a week of such anguish, they just had to be here, as much as it hurts, to make their silent statement to the person responsible, wherever he is. And many people here are contrasting the urgency of market traders returning to work with the apparent snail's pace of the police investigation, an investigation that looks increasingly desperate. Their €100,000 reward, unprecedented and, of course, still unclaimed. It may prove to be the price for saving face, because for all the information that they have access to from interviews, from networks, from surveillance, from home, from abroad, this suspect could be almost anywhere.
OK, Rohit, for now, thank you very much indeed. Now, as 2016 draws to an end, the year's great human catastrophe, the siege of the Syrian city of Aleppo, is doing the same. The Syrian government says its forces are back in full control tonight after more than 4 years of rebel resistance. The last remaining civilians and rebel fighters have finally been evacuated from what remains of their city. It was their city, or at least the little of it that was left. Today, the 4-year rebellion in Aleppo officially came to an end as the last occupants of the rebel enclave in the east who wanted to leave did so. There were plenty of civilians among them, driving away into the uncertain embrace of a chilly Syrian winter. But there were rebel fighters too, making little attempt to hide themselves as their opponents looked on. This has been the most brutal siege. We hardly need reminding, but this is what life was like at the heart of it. Death falling slowly from the clouds, the bombs unguided and indiscriminate. And this was all too often the aftermath. Many civilians killed in their homes or in the streets or in hospitals if they could get there, because they were targets too. It's hard to imagine what it's like to eke out a life in these surroundings. As the months ground on, there simply wasn't much left. It was all so very different at the start. As the Arab Spring spread like wildfire across the Middle East, many people came out into the streets here to protest against a dictator they loathed. But as the last of them left today, the UN was concerned for their safety in their nearby destination, Idlib, another rebel-held enclave.
Many have gone to Idlib, which could be, in theory, the next Aleppo. So we have to look forward. And what is the reply to that? Two. The first one is make sure that the UN has not only access, but also the means, the capacity, the funding for the winter.
Whatever future the rebels may or may not have, tonight Assad and his forces are back in control of a city they have smashed to pieces to, in their words, save. Well, throughout the siege and indeed the civil war, there has been a huge exodus of the Syrian people. They have leaving with nothing, but of course with nothing to return to. The UN says there are now 4.8 million registered refugees who fled Syria's war. Neighbouring countries such as Iraq, Jordan and Lebanon have taken in many of them, but most, 2.7 million people, have ended up in Turkey. Of these, 500,000 are now in Istanbul, among them many thousands who've escaped the horrors of Aleppo and who are now trying to create a new life for themselves at the edge of Europe.
In this Istanbul church, almost half the congregation are Syrian refugees. More evidence that in its birthplace, the Middle Eastern religion that is Christianity is fading away. For the Syrians here, their faith is one of the last vestiges of home they have to cling on to. They've fled war and persecution and fear home will only be a memory from now on, a place never to be returned to. Like many, Naim is from Aleppo.
بحس بحزن كتير كبير I feel sad. Before the war, Aleppo was like heaven, but now it's been destroyed. And watching my country kill itself is breaking my heart.
When the Syrian crisis began, Istanbul was a reliable stepping stone. A turnstile between continents, it was one of the gateways to Europe for refugees fleeing for their lives. All that changed when the EU and Turkey did their deal to halt the flow of people. Now this is the end of the line. Today in Istanbul alone, there are more Syrian refugees than in all of Europe. Famous throughout the ages as a crossroads for people on the move, Istanbul is no longer that, not for Syrians at least. With Europe out of bounds and a return home impossible, this city has become a trap for them, and it's one that's very hard to escape from. Abu Muhammad and his son earn a pittance peddling on the streets of Istanbul. They too are from Aleppo and must provide for themselves and 5 others. The family of 7 live in 2 tiny rooms. For them, every day is a relentless test of urban survival. They don't have the luxury of hopes or dreams.
I don't have a plan in my mind. My family situation doesn't allow it. All my plans are on hold because I don't have any money. You can't make plans without money.
Here and across Turkey, almost 3 million Syrians are struggling to get by. They are also in a state of mourning as the bell tolls for the country they knew and for the diversity that made Syria what it was. John Irvine, News at 10, Istanbul.
Well, back here now, and another English prison is tonight in the grip of a disturbance. Tonight at Swaleside Jail on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent is not on the scale of the Birmingham prison riot a week ago, but fires have been lit and 60 inmates are said to have been involved. Our correspondent Juliet Bremner is there. Juliet, what is happening at this point in the evening there?
Well, I'm about half a mile from Swaleside. It's in that direction, but prison officers won't let us any closer. However, I have just spoken to an eyewitness who's come out and says he believes that it's still very much ongoing. There are loud screams and shouts coming from the wing where they believe the trouble is centred. That's A wing. He says he's seen reinforcements being sent in. He thinks they include specially trained guards. We have one image to show you from inside the wing itself. And you will see that we believe these are inmates with their backs to us and they're showing off the damage, the debris that has been caused. We do have conflicting reports about just what's happening now. The prison service tells us that it's been confined to one landing. The Prison Officers Association says that's not true, that 123 inmates remain unlocked, 60 of them at the centre of this trouble who were in control of the wing and had set fire in several places. So we're not entirely sure how serious it is right now.
From the prison service's point of view, this is in danger of becoming a trend. What's going wrong?
I don't know what's going wrong, but this is certainly a winter of discontent. Obviously, the Prison Officers Union are in dispute. This is the 4th riot we've had within 2 months. And we know that this prison itself was deemed to be dangerous and far too violent by the Inspectorate just this summer.
OK, Juliet, thank you very much indeed. Since Andy Woodward became the first former footballer to say he was abused as a young player, many more have followed, among them 2 of his former teammates. Well, today, for the first time for nearly 30 years, the 3 men met up.
It is 27 years since Mickey Fallon last saw his old teammates, Chris Unsworth, Andy Woodward and Steve Walters. Tonight's reunion emotional, not only because of the experience they shared as teenage footballers, but because of their claims of darker experience that they never told each other about until now.
This is us now. This is forever. This is how we're going to be.
As tough as it is, it's just, I guess you guys feel the same. It just feels like something that I've kept back in my mind for a long, long time. And pretended that it never happened.
Andy Woodward was the first to come forward with the painful story of years of abuse at the hands of youth football coaches. The others followed. And how it's grown. There are now 429 potential victims across the country. Police are investigating 155 potential suspects and looking at 148 clubs, large and small, where alleged abuse of vulnerable young men may have taken place.
We've done it.
Mickey Fallon tonight is the latest to say that as a junior player he too was abused. Inspired to talk out, he says, by the courage of his old friends.
There's good memories as I walk through that door to see them, and at the same time we've been brought together for something that is a massive negative in our life. But I'm just really grateful for both of them for having the courage, and Chris and the others that I don't know for coming forward, and that's what given me the courage to be here today.
Part of the team now.
27 years of keeping a painful secret is over. By telling their stories, they hope the lives of future generations of young footballers will not be blighted as theirs were. Paul Davies, News at 10.
Now, when a runaway 32-ton lorry careered down the main street of a village and crushed 3 men and a 4-year-old girl to death, it looked at first like a terrible accident, perhaps even a mistake by the newly hired driver. But today, the owner of the lorry firm and his mechanic were convicted of manslaughter. The owner cut corners. His mechanic signed off the 11-year-old lorry as safe when its rusty brakes hadn't been properly checked. The worst of it was those 4 lives lost and the unending sadness for the families, but the driver of the lorry, blameless in the whole terrible episode, has had to live with it too.
Fun, outgoing, confident and missed by her family every day. The loss of 4-year-old Mitzi Steady is hard enough to bear, but made worse by the knowledge that she should never have died. She was the first victim of an out-of-control truck with failing brakes, owned and barely managed by a criminally negligent firm. Crushed and killed in the car they were heading home to South Wales in. 3 more victims of a company with scant regard for safety. Robert Parker, Philip Allen and Stephen Vaughan had no defence against a 32-ton truck. Sian Vaughan lost more than her husband that day.
All the plans, the future that we had together has just all been taken away. When obviously, this was all very much preventable. They've denied us of a family, and especially having to spend your first wedding anniversary alone was just so far removed from the one that we had planned. It's just been absolutely horrendous.
The haulage firm was a shambles, rules and regulations flouted at will. It was a corrosive culture that revealed rusting parts, unable to prevent catastrophe. The truck was out of control as it careered down this hill, but that was almost inevitable, given the woeful lack of care and servicing that Grittenham Haulage invested in its trucks. Matthew Gordon, guilty of 4 counts of manslaughter. He owned the company, which failed to comply with even the most routine guidelines. Peter Wood, the mechanic, also guilty of manslaughter. He was supposedly responsible for the vehicle, but in truth took little or no care over its upkeep. Philip Potter, the young, inexperienced driver, was found not guilty of all charges, free to leave court, but scarred by the impact of that day.
Just that they've never not been in my thoughts, they're constantly in my thoughts. And I just hope they can carry on now. That's it.
Thank you. The damage was done long before the truck lost its brakes. The price of neglect, long prison sentences for the guilty, and for the victims, hopes and dreams destroyed. Rupert Evelyn, News at 10, Bristol.
Very tragic story. Now, there have been plenty of warnings about the rather benignly named Storm Barbara, but even so, no one is taking any chances. The storm is expected to hit western Scotland early tomorrow, and it's been pretty windy already today.
Storm Barbara isn't due until tomorrow, but parts of Scotland got the message today. She is on her way. When a storm with a name is coming, it puts people on guard, especially after the floods of last winter. Preparing for tomorrow is adding to the workload at this jewellers in Oban, where the days before Christmas should be their busiest.
Storm Barbara's coming to visit us soon, so we have to batten down the hatches, get our sandbags out and put up our big storm door and hope for the best, hope we don't get flooded.
Barbara hasn't hit yet, but she's already causing all kinds of disruption. With much of the transport to Scotland's islands expected to be cancelled tomorrow, today's ferries were a lifeline for those trying to get home for Christmas.
But our little girl, she's in school and it's her Christmas play tonight, so we're hoping to make it home for that. Otherwise we might be in the bad books.
We've come up from Northampton, but the journey was really good, to be honest, so no, we've been all right, so hopefully the rest of the journey's okay.
We were booked tomorrow, but because of the weather, we're trying on standby today, so...
The storm will roll in early tomorrow morning and Scotland will be the worst hit, with winds of up to 90 miles per hour. The Met Office has already issued amber be prepared warnings for the Highlands, Orkney and Shetland, and there are flood alerts for the Highlands, the Western Isles and the Scottish borders.
Storm Barbara is going to be quite similar to the sort of storms that we had last year, but the impacts will be greater this time round because of the time of year. It's come at the worst time possible, really, a couple of days before Christmas, when lots of people are trying to get home to see family, lots of people trying to head on ferries to go to the islands, and also crossing bridges, where I expect there'll be restrictions too. So the storm will be similar to sort of storms that we get a few times each winter, but probably having bigger impacts just because there's so many people trying to get out and about.
All is calm on the Scottish west coast tonight, but that tends to be the way in these hours before a storm. By dawn, Barbara will be here, and then we're in her hands. Peter Smith, News at 10, Oban.
Heavy storm. Just what you need for Christmas. Now, there's often a worry in the run-up to the big day about elderly relatives making it to where they are supposed to be. But this evening, the Queen and Prince Philip are safely installed at Sandringham, their home in Norfolk. Well enough today to make the journey after all. Their heavy colds appear to have lifted enough for them to lift off in a helicopter from the garden of Buckingham Palace instead of taking the train. And finally, for 40 years, France's biggest Beatles fan has devoted himself to building up a collection of memorabilia, records, photos, posters and the like. You might say it has taken over his life, so much so he's never had a job. He calls himself a Beatles historian rather than a mere fan. Now in his 60s and with no pension, he's having to auction the whole lot off, all 15,000 items.
In a closely guarded lockup in a secret location near Versailles, the life's work of Jacques Volcouve,
Beatlemania, the illustrated treasury.
A man who spent the best part of 5 decades collecting anything and everything to do with the band, who famously aren't even French.
This is your life here, isn't it?
Yes.
Ever since the Beatles played the Olympia Theatre in Paris in 1964, they've had plenty of fans across the channel. But whatever you do, don't tell Jacques he's just a fan. Over the years, in his little Parisian flat, with his 15,000 records, with his 4 decades of memories, his collection of photographs and several books to his name, he's acquired quite a different title.
Everybody said, you are the Beatles historian, you are the Beatles historian. So I said, okay, I give up, I am the Beatles historian. And now I completely accept it. And actually, it's quite nice to be known like that. Présentoir pour les 45 tours, oldies but goldies.
Since 1967, he's been assembling this kind of stuff, but now realises the time has come to move on.
Ça date de 1980, ça.
The pick of it goes on sale at top Parisian auction house Drouot next March. The fact is, it's taken over his life.
You own your collection, or is the collection own you? And it reached a point where the collection owned me.
Nobody really knows how much any of this will fetch at auction, but in the meantime there's plenty of work to be done, with the words of George Harrison always in his ears.
George said, if one person appreciates your work, you didn't have wasted your time.
You haven't wasted your time.
No, I did not have, obviously.
You'd be able to start collecting Rolling Stones memorabilia.
I have records of Rolling Stones here. Yeah.
But until the day of the sale, all this stays under lock and key. Damon Green, News at 10, Paris.
It's just not your everyday story, is it? Let's just take a quick look at tomorrow as Storm Barbara makes landfall on the northwest coast. We'll be tracking the destruction and the disruption to Christmas travel, hopefully kept to a minimum. President Putin will be giving what amounts to his review of 2016. It certainly has been a significant year for him in his end-of-year press conference. Julie will be here for all that and much more at 11 o'clock. But from me, good night and thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a brilliant, peaceful, and very happy Christmas.